Hello? Hi everyone, we're going to get started. So we're very fortunate today to have Nancy Perry and Kelly Murray here from the ASPCA. Nancy is the Senior Vice President of Government Relations, where she oversees legislative efforts and public policy at the local, state and federal government levels. And prior to joining the ASPCA, she was the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Humane Society. And Kelly is Senior Manager of Legislative Advocacy, and she manages ASPCA's grassroots efforts, mobilising advocates into action to support all of ASPCA's strategic goals. And she's also worked with the Animal Welfare Institute and the Animal Legal Defence Fund. Please join me in welcoming Nancy and Kelly.
Thank you so much, Penelope, and all the wonderful students here at Harvard Law School. You were so gracious to have us, and we're super excited to be here to talk about a topic that is of such great importance to us and that we feel is such an incredibly invaluable tool for advancing all of our work to help animals enjoy a better existence on this planet. So it's a lot about empowerment today. We're not going to talk about the usual challenges of the legislative process. We're going to talk about how we take matters into our own hands. So unfortunately, any of us who are involved in animal welfare, and I assume everyone in this room has at least a mild interest or you wouldn't be here, but I bet some of you are very, very involved and have been very involved for a long time and have been exposed to all the horrors that animals face on a daily, hourly, and minute-by-minute basis of their lives. And it's very hard for us as advocates because most of us come to this cause having already an extraordinary sensitivity to their suffering. And then to have to be experts about their suffering is an additional layer of challenge for us. And I think it requires of us a certain kind of tenacity and a certain kind of toughness in order to advance efforts for them. But one thing that we have found is one way to feel better about all of the horrors that animals face is to be a part of making change for them. Even if it's incremental and even if it's small, it does help to allay the way that experiencing, knowing about their suffering makes you feel. So it is, I hope, in the long run, even though we have to hit some challenging topics, pretty empowering to talk about this. One of the big topics before us today, not just us here in this room, but our society, is the question about how we treat animals that have been brought here and raised for food. And it's a big question. It's becoming a broader topic of dialogue. We're seeing it talked about in all different modern mainstream forums. So it's certainly prescient for us today to be talking about it. And one of the big questions relates to the production of eggs. The way that hens are treated and the use of the battery cage, which is a far too small enclosure that many hens are stuffed in so that they don't have any room, any personal space to move about, to express any of their natural behaviors. They live a life that is even worse than if any of us were stuck in an elevator our entire lives with 8 other people. They live that every single day. And so we want to do something about it. And often when we hear about an form of animal abuse, someone says, well, there ought to be a law that prevents that, right? So that's what we work on. That's what we all collectively are thinking about. So it should be easy, right? We just go to Congress and walk up those steps and take it on. Obviously, we work on legislation. We work on federal legislation. We work on state legislation. We love it. We really believe that there is a way to work through that process. But that's not today's talk. Because unfortunately, there is only so much you can do in that forum. There are some obstacles. So let's talk about what happens to get a bill through the process. And the only point of this slide is to give you a feel of how complicated the process is. And the party in power gets to decide every single one of these steps. You see the 1, 2, 3, 4, every red arrow up there is a moment that requires intense momentum and requires a lot of support. And in order to build that support, every one of those moments requires all of our lobbying work behind us. And so you can see where at any point that could become very hard to keep a bill moving. They're not required to move bills through this process. It's all voluntary. And so one of the things that we run into, because we are protecting animals who don't, the act of protecting animals that's not a profit-making sort of act. Unfortunately, abusing animals can be quite profitable. And so we are in that uphill battle of trying to advance an effort that isn't funded the way that the industries we're fighting are funded. So unfortunately, our political system, it's no news to you, this is a reality that we face. Our political system is prone to influence by well-heeled industries. And so there are ways, again, I want to emphasize, there are ways to work with that and ways to push through that. But unfortunately, when we talk about agriculture issues, it's really a heavier lift because that industry, the ag industry, is so well-funded and so well-connected at the federal and state level that we tend to have to fight the guy in the wheelbarrow a lot. And we end up meeting up with these significant roadblocks. And so the good news of today's talk is that not everywhere, but in many, many states, we actually have the opportunity to become empowered and to take matters into our own hands and to advance legislation through our own efforts if we know what we're doing and we do it right. So there is this thing called the ballot measure. And within the ballot measure process, you have initiatives where people take the initiative to gather signatures and place that issue on the ballot before the voters. And then you have referendum, where citizens can either gather signatures and put it before the legislature for them to consider, or the legislature can refer an issue to the ballot for citizens to vote on. So these are just two different types of mechanisms to achieve the same goal, which is to bypass the traditional legislative process. We don't undertake this lightly, because you have to have gone through the process and tried to get your measure through for it to be considered a legitimate use of the ballot measure process. But direct democracy does have a storied history. It's a respected process. 24 states allow us to use the initiative process to gather signatures and place something directly on the ballot. And a few errant other states allow that referendum process where you can gather signatures to place something before the legislature. You'll notice that many of the states are in the West. And I think that the history tells us that has a lot to do with the sort of progressive values that came as the country developed toward the West, and a lot of thoughts about keeping the government out of our lives. That's an interesting sort of different political movement really pushed for direct democracy. It's codified in constitutions, so this is an old process available to us. And interestingly, Massachusetts is one of the lone New England states that has this option for us. So it's pretty exciting that ultimately today we're going to get to talk about the Massachusetts effort to help farm animals. So the overall win-loss record for the animal movement since 1990, there was a history earlier in the 1900s of some vivisection issues and some other issues coming up for animals, but not much success. So we start counting at 1990 because that was a sea change in our thinking on how to do ballot measures. And we became scientists, and we decided to study the process and really understand what it takes to pass a ballot measure and to do it successfully. So 1990 was sort of the era when the Fund for Animals under Wayne Pacelli took up this effort in California, and it started to spread after that. And we have an overall very successful win rate, but more importantly are the specific animals that have been helped by this process. And I think we can't just let the numbers be what drives us. We have to realize there are individual lives that are affected by our ability to do this successfully. And really all manner of animals, not just wildlife, but domestic animals as well. So that's very exciting to see that kind of success. So I'll give you a quick run through of where we've been on this measure. When I was in law school and Lewis and Clark out in Portland, Oregon, I discovered the initiative process there. I had had a history here in Cambridge. My very first job out of college was with a tiny nonprofit, the Cambridge Committee for Responsible Research, and we were going to pass an ordinance to oversee research going on animals that involved unrelieved pain. No big deal, right? Not so much. We were crushed. Harvard, MIT, and Arthur D. Little and about 15 other biotech companies came forward and put millions of dollars together in a PR campaign to ensure that our ordinance didn't get through. And that was my experience. It did end up eventually getting through in a different form. That's the good side. But for me, it really made me think the system doesn't work. I don't want to be a part of this crushing defeat. It's depressing enough to know about animal suffering, but I don't want to be a part of something that can't win. So then when I was in law school, I found out that in fact there is this other opportunity. They allowed the hound hunting and baiting of bears and cougars. And so California had just in 1990 passed a measure to stop all mountain lion hunting and to preserve habitat for mountain lions. And then in Oregon, while I was in law school, so now you can see when I was in law school. So I worked on the Oregon Bear and Cougar Coalition to help gather the signatures and then place that issue on the ballot, and then ultimately protect it in the legislature and protect it from a repeal attempt at the ballot box too. So we had a long history of defending that one. And it really opened up my eyes and taught me it's about knowing how to go forward with these measures and how to do them and how to fund them properly. That's how you do this kind of work. You can't go in thinking, well, it's a good issue, of course people will vote for it. You still have to know how to work that system. So the end result of these efforts were to protect these animals. Baiting is where you leave out rotten food, jelly donuts in the woods to habituate bears to eating at the bait site and then shooting them directly while they're eating with their head in a barrel. So this was also the topic of ballot measures in Oregon. The same ballot measure that we worked on mountain lions in Oregon included bear baiting. And this also was passed in Washington, and Massachusetts did it here in 1996. So that was very exciting. It passed a hounding prohibition on bears. Baiting doesn't happen in the state. So to save black bears. Wolf hunting has been a big topic for ballot measure conversation. And unfortunately in Alaska, the people had to keep putting this measure on the ballot and keep voting for it. And eventually when Sarah Palin was involved, then there was enough money that was brought in to crush the measure. And so the last effort did not win. But there were many successful efforts when it was unfettered by that money. Michigan, thankfully, just rejected 2 pro-wolf hunting measures in the last cycle. So that's very exciting to see that affirmation. Wolves are going to be a continued struggle. I'm sorry to show you this slide. Trapping still galls me that we haven't been able to stop it everywhere. But the ballot measure has helped us prevent these body-gripping traps from being used very successfully. This has been an area of the greatest number of successes. 5 out of 7 attempts passed to stop trapping of fur-bearing animals. So we can save him. And then horse slaughter, another grisly one, I'm sorry. But when horse slaughter was allowed in this country, California said we're going to go after that. And in 1998, they passed a ballot measure in California to ban it. We're still working on that one federally. I bet a lot of you know about that work, and we will never give up until we ban it, and we're going to do it. So these sometimes have to be coordinated in a number of different forums, not just state work, but federal work too. So we can save horses. And then mourning dove hunting, we took this up in Michigan where it was a very popular activity, and we won in every single county in that ballot measure. So that tells you, again, the power. This is a very pro-hunting state, but we worked with the churches in Michigan. We had an incredibly powerful grassroots organization. Very successful result to get mourning doves off the hunting roster. Greyhound racing, this state had to do it twice, had to go after it twice, but good job, because persistence is ultimately what wins the day with all of this work. And so now greyhound racing is banned in Massachusetts via the ballot measure. And that's the result. So cockfighting also was one of those weird, gruesome blood sports that hung in there for a long time. State by state, a lot of states didn't want to let it go. So we worked at it one by one to bring some victories. And ultimately, we got these 3 states by ballot measure, and the final 2 passed through the legislature because they started to get isolated. So sometimes if the ballot measure doesn't exist in a state, you can still use it to exert pressure on their neighbor to make them realize that we're coming for you, and you better get with it. You better move forward in history. So that was very successful use of ballot measure, even though it wasn't in those states, to save this guy. Puppy mills. You can't see it too well, but these are dogs stuck in crates in outdoor enclosures. This is the factory farming of dogs for the pet trade. I'm sure you're very familiar with this problem. This is something that we decided to attack right in the epicenter. Missouri is one of the big puppy mill states. We went, we got the signatures, we put it on the ballot, we passed it by a very tight margin, barely passed. And unfortunately, when you barely win like that, it's a bit of an invitation to the legislature to come in and undo it. And they made some downward adjustments in the provisions of that bill. It's still, ironically, one of the strongest anti-puppy mill laws in the country, and it provided a lot of funding for enforcement. So we actually saw a lot of millers go out of business as a result of that. So that was a good, even in defeat, there was victory. And it was a very important forum for attacking that issue so that we could see more of this instead of the dogs in the horrible cages. And then we come to farmed animals. And the progress for using the ballot measure for farmed animals has been amazing. It started in Florida. We decided to address gestation crates, which are tiny metal cages that gestating sows are kept in for the vast majority of their lives while they're pregnant and waiting to give birth. And gestation crates were banned in Florida in 2002 by the ballot measure. And there it's a very challenging process. It's a constitutional amendment by state law. You have to go that route. You need an enormous number of signatures. So it was an incredible, incredible victory. And the first time a farm animal had been protected through the ballot measure. So as a result of that work, advocates out in Arizona said, we want to do that too. And they added veal crates to their measure. And they passed their measure. And then California, the precursor to the measure taking place right now in Massachusetts, came out in 2008, Prop 2 as it's known. So that's been a very successful effort. And again, state legislatures have passed reform measures as a result of the pressure of that ballot measure success. Then we have veal crates. So this is, again, Arizona took these up and California added it. So every time we did a new measure, we added some additional reform to it, building momentum. And then we saw other states pass veal crate bans. So again, just showing that momentum that comes. Battery cages, the first time we took that up was in California. So that's the last one that's been picked up. And that was an enormously successful ballot measure campaign. So we'll talk more about why that was so that we could see more of this. So when you see all that work, you think, wow, this is great. We've got to do this. We're going to get every issue that way. Well, we can't do everything this way. I want to now kind of take us down a notch. There are some rules, and I'm going to share some of the wisdom that we've accumulated from all these trial and errors because we haven't won every ballot measure. So you end up learning a lot in loss. Here are the golden rules. You poll carefully, and you only ever use a ballot measure process after you've tried the legislature and you know that the public is fully with you because the support for your measure is going to erode due to the pressure from opposition. So that's a very important golden rule. You always do research before you announce the measure to really look into the dirty laundry of your opponents and make sure you know all the data because they're going to hide all that the minute they know you're coming for them. And that proved invaluable in California. And then you starve the campaign until the final phase that we're turning around the corner on. And so any of you who've been involved in the effort here, so you know that it's not a lavish sort of scene, and it's not going to be. You save every penny for your advertising efforts because that's where you really retain support for the measure. So in California, we did a little opposition research before we announced. And we found that UC Irvine's ag department had done some research on the question of converting from battery cage use to produce eggs to cage-free. And they found that, in fact, less than 1 penny was the expense of converting per egg for the producer. So that's really a tiny, tiny addition to their costs. Now, whether they choose to pass that on in spades to consumers, that's a different matter. But we knew that they would have substantially small costs for that conversion because the ag industry had said it themselves. And they grew to rue the day that they ever produced that study. We used that relentlessly against the talking points that came out. Also through our data work, we found that the industry had been working together more than they probably should have by law. And as a result of that, there was very significant litigation that came going after the egg industry for collusion. So when you look at what collusion is, it's when rival portions of an industry work together to fix the price and to adjust the way the product is produced in order to make more money, right? That's collusion. So we looked at the newsletters that the egg industry in California was putting out. They had come up with this animal care system that was supposed to be about animal care, but it basically ensured that there was less output and therefore was a price fixing scheme. And these kinds of statements, talking about the agreements that were made and grousing at each other, were made publicly in newsletters. So had they known we had a campaign coming, they would have never put this out there, but we were able to get these statements, one after another, just damning statements that they were making about their program. Then they claimed, oh, prices are going to go through the roof if we pass Prop 2. But in fact, they were talking about the soaring prices they already had in California in their newsletter. Highest in recorded history. These were dream statements. So we'd go in to talk to an editorial board, we'd get in an interview with a reporter and be able to trot out what the industry itself had been saying about its own prices. Egg prices are soaring. Incredible statements. I mean, here's the worst. We've never seen profits like this. I really think 2009 looks pretty good as well. Conditions in the egg industry are fantasy land. So that was it. That was golden. And that helped us so much to peel away the facade that was being presented to the public about how they were just trying to help the public have this cheap protein source. It was all just made up for profit's sake. So that was very important. And it led to the Wall Street Journal and to Business Week talking about collusion. And that litigation is still unwinding. Once I'm a lawyer, so I can say it. Once the sharks start to circle when you have collusion or price fixing, it just goes into its own world, and the egg industry wishes we'd never done that. A lot of good results came out of it other than that. We saw incredible expenditures from the ag industry and incredible votes from the voters. 63.5% of California voters supported it. That was more than any other measure at that time. And we saw the victory came regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of economic class, regardless of geography. Even the big farming counties voted for it. So we were really thrilled about that victory. And that led all of us to start thinking, well, where else do consumers care about animals? And clearly Massachusetts, you saw, has an incredible history of caring about animals through the ballot process and other legislative work. So we thought we should all get together here. And I think the take-home lesson for all of us is this isn't, again, a tool to just be used lightly. It has to be done in a really coordinated, really carefully thought-out strategic way. It can't just be thrown together because it's incredibly regulated, as I'll show you in a moment. And if you make one mistake, it can throw the whole process off either permanently or for a very long time. So you have to have expertise and be willing to coordinate really well. And we do a lot of training through the process to make sure we have a tightly run ship. So here's the timeline. I'm going to breeze through this because it's kind of boring regulatory language, but it shows you the breadth and the depth that the Secretary of the Commonwealth and the AG go to ensure that this is a regulated process. You have an indirect process in Massachusetts, so not only do you have to gather signatures, but then it goes before the legislature after that, and they have an opportunity to act until May 3rd. And then we have to gather a smaller number of signatures again, and then it goes in the ballot. So it's a hybrid. Here's just the basic rundown. This is a summary of the AG and the Commonwealth Secretary language. So you create a committee. There's very precise requirements about the petition. The blank petition has to be printed properly. No random marks on it. There's an incredibly in-depth process around the signature collection. You have to get 5% of the last gubernatorial election, and that ended up being technically 65,000 valid, but you need a good cushion more than that, so we never really say that number out loud. We say, we're going for 90,000, and we ended up turning in 130,000. So an incredible result here. And then there's a distribution requirement. You can't get them all just from Boston. You have to have a reasonable number from around the state. So they really are looking to make sure that this is done properly. Then the legislature has its chance to work on this. And then there's actually a title being prepared that will start happening soon. And there will be a public comment period. And you can even challenge the title if it's not fair and balanced. And then we have round 2 of signature gathering. That's coming up soon. And we will need 0.5% of the total votes that were cast in the last gubernatorial election. We're shooting for around 20,000 for that. Should be easy after 133, but we've got to gear our machine back up. Another distribution requirement there. And then we have to turn all those signatures, as we did the first time, into the local registrars. They certify them. Then they have to go to the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So there's a whole process of driving around the state. Many of you might have been drivers and involved. I see smiles. So it's a really incredible process. And if you have a tight ship, you can do it here in Massachusetts. So it's very exciting to have that opportunity. And then we win if we get a majority of votes. Oh, and 30% of voters have to vote for it too. Because people can go vote and not vote on the questions. They can just vote for candidates. So we need to make sure we get enthusiasm enough to get at least 30%. And that's usually not a problem, but... And then there's the sad pig. The legislature actually can go in and amend or repeal it. So what are we doing? Why are we wasting all our time on this if they can go do that? Well, the reality is once you've gone through all this effort, it's such a threat to legislators to know that you know how to do it, you have the willingness and ability to do it, that it really sends the signal. And frankly, at that point, it's the voters. The voters have voted for it. So do legislators really want to go in and undo something so directly in the face of the voters? That's the question. And I think that is why we have to go forward. We have to push this. We have to take that risk. And we know that we will be very good at being a part of that legislative process later on when we have to face that as well. So that's my portion. I want Kelly to tell you about her experience because she was on the ground here and has wonderful knowledge about what happened here.
Hi everyone. As I look around the room today, I see many faces that I got to know well this fall while we were working on our first signature gathering round of this campaign. This image that you see right here was taken on December 2nd. Nancy referenced this day earlier. This is the day that we turned in over 133,000 signatures to the Secretary of the Commonwealth. It may not look like it, but those boxes right there hold all 133,000 signatures. I'm going to keep this brief because I know we have limited time, but I would love to talk to any of you that are interested in getting involved after this presentation because there's a lot that needs to be done. This picture right here represents only a tiny fraction of the over 700 volunteers in Massachusetts that collected signatures throughout this fall. Rain or shine, sleet or snow, people collected signatures. So as Nancy referenced earlier, we collected these 132,000 signatures, but that was only the first phase of the campaign. And the first phase of the campaign was primarily advocacy-driven, very grassroots-focused, because we can't expend a lot of money during this first phase. That's coming later in the summer and fall. Right now, there's three main phases that we're looking at coming up. Right now, we are in the endorsements phase. So I know some of you have worked hard going door to door to collect endorsements right now. What are endorsements and why do we need them? Endorsements, as you can see here, can come from vets, farmers, animal welfare organizations, there's food safety organizations. We even have dry cleaners, you name it. Any type of local business, we want their support. However, the vets and the family farmers really speak volumes to the legislators here. They really show that people aren't afraid of treating animals humanely. And that's when Nancy talked about earlier, you know, the legislature does have the opportunity to act on this bill, to modify it. That will keep them from doing this if we win with a large enough vote and if we can show we have enough public support from the people that this affects. Last week, the legislature did actually hear this bill. We had an amazing turnout from animal advocates. I have no doubt there were many of you here that were in that room. While we had a lot of animal advocates testify, again, going back to what the legislatures really care about, we had farmers, local farmers who, in theory, I've been to some of these hearings on animal welfare issues in Massachusetts, and the legislature, or the committee that heard this is a joint committee on environment, natural resources, and agriculture. That means it has House and Senate members. And they're not necessarily animal friendly, to say the least, on a lot of issues. But when they have farmers, local farmers that are going to be affected by these laws testifying, they're forced to really listen and to say, oh, well, it's not just the crazy animal people that want this. We actually have businesses in our community that want this as well. So this brings me, the legislature, as Nancy said, has the opportunity to act until May 3rd. May 4th will kick off. We don't expect them to act. Let me just say that. This has been in the legislature. We've tried to get it approved. As Nancy says, that's always something you do first before you proceed to the ballot measure. You try to get something passed through the legislature. And we've been trying to get versions of this passed for several sessions with no luck. So we will, assuming they don't act, we will move on to the second signature gathering phase. This is a very easy lift for us, given that we just collected over 133,000 signatures and we'll only need 20,000. That being said, there are some tricky parts to it because they can't be duplicate signatures. So we need all hands on deck for this. Please go to citizensforfarmanimals.com or talk to me afterwards on how you can get involved. Even if you're not a voter here in the state, even if you're not a permanent resident, that doesn't matter. Everyone can help, so please do. And lastly, the final phase of the campaign is the get out the vote effort. This is really where you're going to see the shift in how we've been operating this campaign. You'll see the grassroots portion will continue, particularly through the summer. We just really want to get people involved. We want to raise awareness. But come fall, it's really going to focus on a media fundraising effort. That being said, there's still a lot of opportunities to get involved. And most importantly, you want to spread the word. It's up to you to be the voice for the animals because they have no voice. So we are all they have. And how we message around this is vital because that's what people and that's what legislators are going to hear. We're going to accept questions on this, but again, if you're interested in helping, please let me know.
We really wanted to leave time to hear what your thoughts and concerns are. That's our sense of what's going on with this. What do you all think about this? Any questions, thoughts around this issue?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. So this isn't, I guess, a directly relevant question, but looking at your signatures photo op and looking around this room, I was just wondering if y'all could comment on demographics, gender demographics.
Sure.
I'll start by saying I think that the animal protection movement has historically been challenged it has not been a very diverse movement. It's a bit of a luxury when you realize that we're talking about the suffering of non-humans who we're not representing our own cause as advocates. So it's a luxury to be in a position to advocate entirely for someone else. That said, in recent years, we're starting to see really tremendous signs of interest from all communities and a lot more outreach work going on. I can tell you that, for example, I'll just mention on the cockfighting issue, it got pigeonholed in the eyes of a lot of the press and a lot of the legislators as this is a Latino issue and you're attacking a culture if you go after the cockfighting activity. And what ended up happening was strong outcry from the Latino community and people saying, no, this is not our culture. And we are not going to own that. And that is not a justification, even if it were. So it's nice to see some of that sort of strong, diverse voice coming out. We have a long way to go, for sure, on that. I don't know if Kelly has thoughts about this particular campaign.
Sure.
Great.
Just briefly, I'll add that the polling, again, Nancy referenced that we always do polling before jumping into a ballot measure, and the polling for this showed overwhelming support across demographics, really no variance when looking at the support for this ballot measure. Also, on a personal note, I have spent a lot of time signature gathering at different locations across the state, and I can tell you, Whole Foods, between Whole Foods and Walmart, you get just as many signatures, if not more, from Walmart, and a more enthusiastic person saying, I support this, and they want to tell you their story. You don't get that at Whole Foods. It's a quick signature, off you go. So the support is
economic diversity, we have solid support.
Very, very much the same across the
different types of diversity, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have a question about a slightly different. I think I'm loud enough.
I think it's for the recording.
Oh, okay. So my question is about trying different kinds of legislature for the same, to end at the same place. So you probably know about all the laws that are required for a farm to be certified organic, and that will make a huge difference for their income. So a little farmer, the laws are made by the big farms.
Yes.
So the little farmer cannot certify his farm, and therefore he's still struggling and not even making ends meet, not evening out his costs at the end of the tax year.
Yeah.
So if you take up those laws, and because the way they are made to require of a small farmer to have a big farm-like facilities, including the cages, the concrete floors. So, and that seems to me really easy to take out, because actually it is not necessary. I volunteered on a farm for 4 years.
Yeah.
Wooden floor in the barn, cows come in twice a day and come out, you can eat off that floor. It smells wonderful. They've never had any infection. They never have to give antibiotics to their cows for anything. So those laws are completely unnecessary, and they're just made to curb the little farmers. So what do you think about that? Can you take them?
Well, I agree with your analysis of those laws. I am concerned that we not confuse that laws are always rational, though, because there isn't a rational basis for a lot of the laws that and the requirements that you see like that, except for the way that industry has moved in recent years. When the mechanization of factory farming really took off, we started to see a lot more large corporation ownership, and that included a lot of verticalization of the industry. And that means that those corporations own every part of from the birth through the process of growing to the slaughter, to the transport, to the packaging, all of it. And so that ends up putting a lot of pressure on anyone who's not interested in farming at that level and who wants to be a much more traditional, family-based, small, humane style farmer. So it's absolutely true, and that crushing process is looked at right now under the organic rules. USDA is looking, we're actually working to pressure them to reopen that, to consider exactly the kinds of things you're talking about. At the state level, there are a lot of regulations and a lot of rules that need to be looked at. But it's the influence of the corporate money that has caused that. And so it seems like it would be easy to erase those nonsensical requirements, but unfortunately the lock hold that industry has on committee chairs and through their contributions, it's extraordinarily hard.
Well, that's actually what I didn't want to be that direct, but I think if you look at the USDA people who are making decisions, who are making final decisions, they're all ex-Hood or other CEOs. So what I was really wondering is, can you do the same? Yes, why not? You just mentioned sharks earlier on, so it sounds like a really good idea.
Well, I think we do need to, if what you say by do the same, I think, we do need to get ourselves into those forums. We need to be elected officials. You need to be elected officials. You need to be federal agents and work within the agencies that govern this kind of question. So I think that's critically important. And that's why when I talk to law students, I think about when I was in law school, we all thought, okay, I'm going to go advocate for animals. There's one path to do that. I think the world is different now, and I think there are a multitude of paths to affect change for animals. We look to hire people at the ASPCA who served within federal agencies, who've been enforcing the law from that vantage point. One of the best things you can do is go work for folks that are not on the right side of the issue, to learn about how they function and to become an expert in the field. So I think we need to be broad in our thought about how we can affect change. It's not one way. And you're pointing up a really serious problem. I know the National Black Farmers Association just spoke out recently about how they're struggling over that. There are just so many ways in which the farming community needs to be embraced in these values. And I think that's what you saw with the testimony last week. The pork checkoff issue is a hot issue right now. The same dynamic is playing out. So we could talk a long time about it, so I'll resist the temptation. Chris?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the Michigan situation? Because I think there's a lot of twists and turns of the legislature trying to then do away with the ballot initiative vote process over the wolves, and if you could explain just a bit about that.
You want to depress everyone, don't you? No, it was very positive in the end, and it's going to continue to be a struggle. So the wolf issue, I will just say, there are many different subpopulations of wolves in the country, and they're governed certainly by the Federal Endangered Species Act, even though there's been a lot of politics around whether they should or should not be covered. Ultimately, they received some protection through the last funding package in Congress, but there are still states that are working through the process of trying to have hunts on wolves, if you can imagine. I mean, these are predators, top-line predators. Traditional notions around hunting, for whatever you may think about hunting, was always that it would be a fair chase and that you would eat what you hunted. And when you're talking about hunting predators, and this is the same argument that came up on mountain lions and on black bears, I mean, these are predators. So yes, you can eat bear meat. It is physically possible to do that. Do people subsist off of that? No, not normally. And so it ends up being for sport and for trophy for the most part. And that's what the wolf hunts were all about, as well as the dynamic that the ranching industry has with trying to protect its livestock, which, let's unveil that. I mean, these are animals that are being raised to make profit and to be slaughtered for food. So while that is a protective instinct to want to protect those animals for sure, there are other ways that the ranching community can protect those animals without killing predators. And the methods by which they keep those animals, they're free roaming out in the habitat of mountain lions and bears and wolves and coyotes. So it's of course going to happen that there's going to be predation. So wolves have become the scapegoat of the day right now. And in Michigan in particular, I think what Chris was alluding to is we saw a lot of dynamic of people putting the issue on the ballot and then having it pass and then having it overturned by the legislature over and over. The same thing that we saw with the aerial gunning of wolves in Alaska. Something about wolves, and I don't know if it's the archetype, Red Riding Hood myth that just gets very deep. I think humans have a particularly strong response to the notion of being eaten. And I think even though predators rarely eat humans, I mean, it really is extraordinarily rare. When I worked on the mountain lion campaigns, we had the stats on, you were 7 times more likely to die from a falling soccer goalpost than from a mountain lion attack. And people still, the imagination goes wild with the idea of being attacked. So I think that is useful as a tool for those who wish to bring wolf hunts and to extirpate wolves. And most of the state hunts are not measured hunts. They involve use of dogs, trapping, all kinds of horrific, very unfair mechanisms. So I will just leave it at, there's an ongoing battle. We're in a good place right now in Michigan on that. Congress isn't done with that issue. And I think this next election is going to bear tremendous influence on all of these issues. But certainly the hot issues of the day will flip one way or the other based on who we get in office and then how they're able to interact with Congress. It's a pretty important time. Yeah.
Do you mind if I take the question first?
Oh, yeah, no.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. I'm sorry.
It's
Go.
okay. Yeah, no
You're
problem.
next,
Thank you.
and then we'll switch over to you.
Right on. So, thank you very much. You're ending the presentation with a very cute dog saying, "Get out the vote." How many people, by a show of hands, are Massachusetts residents here? Okay. And how many of you are registered to vote in Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, I just moved here from Michigan, not a Massachusetts resident.
Okay.
And throughout the talk, I never learned how to go register to vote. Mm-hmm. So, how should those who are registered, who may have friends who are not registered, how do they go and vote?
Thank you. We've just done some polling of our own membership and found that a lot of our members aren't registered voters. So we're shocked and horrified, and we're on the same idea that we really need to get people to register. It actually ends up mattering with legislators in our lobbying work. It matters certainly for going to the ballot box. So thank you for raising that.
It's
Kelly.
very simple here. You can go online. If you just Google register to vote in Massachusetts, you'll see a form. You can print that out, fill it out. It will literally take you 90 seconds to fill it all in, address it, and send it off. So a simple process, but literally can make a huge difference when it comes to this effort. So please not only for this effort, but for all efforts, all animal efforts. Please register to vote if you haven't, wherever you are a resident.
Thanks, Michigan.
I know you said that you finished talking about the wolves, but I had a question still about them.
Fine.
Sorry. So I was wondering if you guys had, because there's been so much like repulsion, like looking at trophy hunters in Africa
Yes.
and like hatred on them, and it always was super weird to me that never crossed over to the big awesome predators in our country.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you had seen or like ASPCA had any experience like tagging teams with some of the conservation efforts where they like, you know, hate that guy that shot the lion, Cecil, and then like if you just kind of try and like move that over to this movement, like to save wolves, or if that's kind of too hard to string together.
Well, I'll just say, so the ASPCA, traditionally, we're 150 years old this year. It's a really old organization, really great, incredible depth on dog, cat, and horse issues. And so we tend to focus our energy, this is just me expressing like who the ASPCA is. However, we've supported and endorsed a lot of legislation related to wildlife, including the wolf issues, but we're not the leader on those issues, so I don't want to misrepresent that. HSUS, along with many other wildlife groups and environmental groups, have worked pretty hard on that issue. Not all of them agree on the wolf issue, but HSUS is spearheading what I think are the humane efforts around that. And I've seen, even just in the last 2 weeks, a lot of messaging around Cecil and talking about how a study was just conducted talking about how the American hunter is the most voracious internationally. And so a lot of that large trophy hunting is going on here. You know, we're the cause of it. On top of that, we are trying to make that connection and say, well, animals are animals. And when you're talking about trophy hunting, there's plenty of that going on here in this country. It's a challenging argument for a lot of people because they start to feel like, well, this is a tradition that is deeply held. But when you really look at the hunting industry, as I have over the years working on these ballot measures, you find, again, that there are a minority of hunters who practice that activity in that old and traditional way and consume what they eat and do it in order not to support factory farming, for example. There are hunters who do that. That's a tiny number. Then you have a huge industry that promotes high-tech fashion, like all types of ways to hunt that create a total imbalance in, you know, the opportunity for the prey to elude the hunter, all sorts of sort of inappropriate overlay, and a lot of just pure killing for fun. There are killing contests in many states. And ALDF has done a lot of work on going after those as well. There are a lot of groups that are taking that up. And so yes, I think it's happening, and the Cecil experience has been very eye-opening in terms of people being willing to be outraged for those animals. Thank you. You guys have a lot of questions. It's great.
Thank you. So I had a more general question. I think it was a really valid point that you brought up about the demographic in this room and how a lot of us here are women. And also what you said about suggesting that us trying to step into the role of an elected official or working for a federal agency could be very good for this kind of movement in our perspective. So I'm wondering if you two personally could offer any advice as to how to navigate the kind of career you have had as a woman, like working in lobbying and politics. If you had any advice about that for us.
Kelly, what's your experience been?
Sure. My experience is a little untraditional. I, after undergrad, went to business school and had a business career for the first 8 years, my professional career, and decided animal welfare had always been my passion. So I thought I should go be an animal litigator. I should litigate. That's what I should do. So I decided to go to law school, which I loved, and actually work with Chris, Animal Legal Defense Fund, while I clerked there. Thought I was going to be a litigator, and I was lucky enough to take a class. So all of you that are not 3Ls graduating, I encourage you to try and take as many diverse classes as you can, particularly with litigation and lobbying, if they can compare and contrast the two. I was lucky enough to have that sort of class with Nancy. She teaches one every summer. It's a 2 to 3 week course at Lewis and Clark. I didn't go to Lewis and Clark, but I took that class, and it completely changed my career path. I thought, oh wow, this is not really something they ever talk about in law school. I mean, maybe, you know, we hit on it, but you never focus on the legislative lobbying side of things. So for me, that was really interesting, and it was so interesting that I realized while I took her class, it was in DC, and I realized DC is where I can really get experience with that. Never thinking I would move there, but I interned with her for a semester while I was in law school as well. And I really think that, for me, if I had not done an internship related to, it didn't have to be with Nancy, but I was lucky that it was at the ASPCA. But if you want to get into legislative work, I highly recommend interning on the Hill. Mm-hmm. It makes a huge difference. You're not going to get a staff position, at least on the federal level, if you haven't interned there. It's like a rare unicorn that would ever happen. Mm-hmm. So I would recommend interning on the Hill, or let's say you want to work in, you want to work in the animal welfare movement, perhaps as a lobbyist. HSUS, AWI, ASPCA, we all have fantastic internships on that. That being said, and I'll let Nancy elaborate on this, it is really helpful if you have experience in an organization, let's say an agency. We have a coworker that came from the USDA, or even like a company like Tyson. That seems strange, the animal welfare advocate would go work for Tyson, but it would be invaluable to have that inside knowledge. So as varied as you can be with your experience, it's going to help you tremendously.
Yeah, I was thinking about that question with regard to gender in particular, and I went to Wellesley for undergrad, so I was in an all-women's environment, and I was fortunate to see women in leadership roles there, and it was just so natural, and it just made so much sense to me. So, I think our job as women is to move forward assuming that we will be taken seriously, and if we are not, then we push harder. And we know the information, what is the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers joke that she did all the same dances but backwards and in heels? I don't think that that's gone from society. I think we're watching that play out in some of our federal politics. We have still some biases to overcome, but we can level the playing field by being experts ourselves and demanding that of ourselves, and training ourselves to be leaders and to think as leaders. So a lot of it is adopting a mindset, and then a lot of it too is just thinking carefully about your own trajectory. I think the best advice unrelated to gender is just to identify who in the field is out there doing work that you think is really good, and then finding ways to work with them. And there are some remarkably strong advocates here in Massachusetts in the state legislature. Cara Holmquist is fabulous, Laura Hagan, amazing. They have internship opportunities, they take volunteers. So even if the federal idea seems remote and challenging for whatever reason, every state legislature has opportunities available. And I think it's really important to just go become invaluable. When I was in law school and worked on that ballot campaign, I had no idea that I would end up wanting to do this exact kind of work. I just was on fire that we had to win. I just was obsessed. And I think when you become obsessed with something in that positive way, you shine, and you learn what you need to learn, and you show that. And then someone sees that and says, oh, we need that on our team. And there's so many teams now. It's a much better situation than it was 20 years ago. There are a lot of fantastic organizations doing fantastic work. So I think it's a positive message for people. Happy to talk more about that individually. I have my cards here too, and it's a little after the hour, so I want to be respectful of people's schedules, but I'm more than happy. Kelly and I will talk all day if you want to talk to us, so we'll hang out here for a bit more.
Thank you everyone for
being
coming.
a part of this today. Thank you.